Hi, have you ever got curious when you enter some URL in the browser and once you click on enter, it fetches some data from the wild and show a beautiful UI on the screen? If not, let's discuss this interesting topic. This is my client machine from where I'm going to enter a URL and fetch some data. Okay, so this is my client machine. So I have somewhere my web application which is hosted in a server. So where I got my HTML, CSS, all my images, JS files, fonts, all that stuff, you know, present here. So now what I want, this client machine has to get some data from this server. Okay, get some data from this server and shown it here. So how it's happening? To get some data from this server, the client machine has to identify this machine, okay, identify this server with the help of some address, right? To the server address, let's suppose 10.4.39.1. But what we enter here? We enter some name. For example, if you www.example.com, okay, when I enter this domain name, right, it has to fetch its corresponding IP address of that particular server. Because why we are using these domain names here? Because we are not we cannot able to remember these numbers. So if we use this domain name, it is easy to remember, so that whenever we type this domain name, right, it will be converted to, like, it will, based on the domain name, we will find that IP address and we will search for that IP address on the internet and we will find the server. So how it happens? So the first step is we need to find the IP address. We need to find IP address of the server. Once we find the IP address, we need to make a connection. Once we make the connection, we need to request for resources. So we, to display something on the screen, right, we need some resources, images, HTML, JS, all that stuff. All that stuff is present here. So that stuff we need to request from the server. Once we get the resources from the server, we need to handle those resources. Once we, after handling, we need to show it on the UI. Okay, we need to render those resources on the UI. We can club these two steps, like handling a resources and rendering something onto the screen. UI is called as critical rendering path. It actually involves some sequence of steps where, like, the HTML get parsed, like all that CSS get parsed and shown it on the UI. Okay, now, so how to find an IP address? So whenever we create a, we entered some domain name in the URL, and when we click on enter, right, what will happen? Browser actually look up for DNS. Okay, so DNS is a domain name system. So what is DNS? So it is actually just like a phone book. Okay, it actually contains a domain name and its corresponding IP. So for example, we have example.com, right? So example.com will have 10.4.39.1. This is the corresponding IP address that we need to find. So how browser actually finds this IP address? Browser actually tries to find the IP address in its local machine first. Browser locals cache. Okay, browser's cache. First it will check in the browser's cache, because we might have already entered the same domain name previously, so that the corresponding IP address might have been already saved in the browser cache. If not, if the browser couldn't find it, then it will check it in the OS cache. Still browser didn't get any luck to find the IP address, then it will go to the routers routers cache. Still didn't get it, then it will check the internet service provider, right, ISP's DNS server. If it finds, it's okay. If it still couldn't find it, then it will search the other DNS servers on the internet. Okay, it will ask for other DNS servers for the IP. First, suppose we got the IP address here. Okay, we got the IP. Then what it will do is, like, the browser search for that IP in the internet and make a connection. Okay, that connection is TCP connection. So it will create a connection and with the help of handshakes. If it is a HTTP three-way handshake, if it is HTTPS, there will be a four-way handshake, all that stuff. So once we establish a TCP connection, right, the browser actually request for web resources. It actually request a HTTP request for web resources. Okay. Once the request gets reached the server responds with some resources. Okay, server responds with some resources. So let's make it as a green. So server responds with some resources. So once we get a response from the server, browser needs to handle those resources, and this way of handling and rendering those resources onto the screen will take a series of steps. That steps are called critical rendering path. For suppose we make the request and server responds with a packet of HTML. This period of hitting URL on the browser to getting the HTML packet, first HTML packet, is called time to first byte. Okay, time to first byte, TTFB. So once we get the first time to first byte, right, then comes the critical rendering path process. Okay, the series of steps will start executing. For example, let's suppose this is our HTML, first packet of HTML that got from the server. Now we got the HTML. Now this needs to be parsed. For example, in this critical rendering path, right, we have a 5 steps. First, it needs to parse the HTML and create DOM, and then it needs to parse the styling related stuff and create CSS object model. Once DOM and CSS model got created, right, it needs to combine these two and create a render tree. Once we got the render tree, we need to the browser need to lay out each node in the render tree. Once it is done, it has to rasterize or paint the changes on the screen. Now let's understand each step of this critical rendering path in depth. For example, I have already shown you guys the code of first HTML packet that we received from the server. Now this HTML page, how it will be appear in the screen? See, for example, if you take look at that code, right, it will be converted to the UI in a beautiful way. So how browser executes this, parses this code to this? So here the HTML file needs to be executed line by line. Okay, and it needs to be parsed, right? So while parsing, what it will do, it will create a DOM, document object model. So here is the HTML, and then head will be created, and then body will be created, and inside the body we got a div and a script. Inside the div we got a h1 tag and a paragraph. This DOM is getting created. Now while parsing, right, if it encounters this styles related stuff or images related stuff, these styles and images won't block the parsing of HTML script. Okay, that's why, so parsing won't stop, and it will continue until and unless it encounters a script tag. If it encounters a script tag, what will happen? Let's discuss it in a deep way. Okay, for example, if you take a script tag, right, so if we that's why whenever we use a script tag, most of the developers suggest us to use a script tag before ending of the body tag. Why? Because the HTML will be parsed, right? If we use normal script tag at the top, HTML will be parsed, and then the script will be downloaded, and then once the script gets downloaded, script will be executed, then only the remaining HTML will be executed. That's why every time it is suggested to use script tag before the ending tag of body tag, so that all the HTML will be parsed by, and then the script will be downloaded and executed. This is what happens actually. So if we use a async keyword inside the script tag, what will happen? The HTML will be parsed. Okay, along with the HTML parsing, when it encounters a script tag, the script will be downloaded. Okay, so here the parallel HTML script is getting parsed, and then JavaScript is also getting downloaded. Once the JavaScript gets downloaded, the script gets downloaded, it will be executed and the remaining HTML content will be parsed. When it comes to differ keyword, right? So what will happen? So along with the HTML parsing, the script will be downloaded, but it won't get executed when the script download is completed. It will be executed once the HTML, all the HTML code get parsed. Now we understand what will happen if we encounter a script tag, right? So it will actually how it is blocking and how to handle and how to improve the performance. While parsing this HTML code, we are creating a DOM. So if you look at the DOM for this particular code, so we got a HTML here, and then head and body got created, and inside the body we got script and div, h1 and paragraph. Now the DOM creation of DOM is completed. Now if you look at the CSS object model, so this is the first step of critical rendering path, and this is the second step of critical rendering path, where CSS users follow some rules like PSS, specificity, hierarchy, inheritance, all that stuff, and it actually creates a tree where what are the UI elements that needs some styles. It will attach styles to each node and make a tree. Now the second step of creating a CSS object model is also completed. Now once browser identify that CSS object model is also completed, it executes the third step of creating render tree. Okay, this is the third step. Here if you look at the paragraph element have a display none property, that means it won't appear in the UI. So in render tree, so render tree only contains the elements or nodes which are going to be displayed in the UI. Here the paragraph has a display none property, so it combines both DOM and CSS object model. So while combining, this paragraph will have a display none property assigned to it, so it won't be there in the render tree. This is how the render tree got created. Now once we create the render tree, right, what will happen? We need to layout it. I mean the browser need to layout it. What is layouting node? For example, if we got the UI, right, so this UI may be rendered in mobile or some a tablet or some large screen. Based on the device, based on the viewport width and viewport height, it has to layout each node. Here we got this div, this h1, right? So how much width and height these elements needs to occupy, that has to be decided, right? That will be decided in this step. It will decide the dimensions for each node. Once the dimensions are fixed, dimensions are assigned to each node, then browser will start painting these changes on the UI. This painting the changes on the UI is also called rastering. Oof. Yeah, that's actually the UI is getting rendered on the browser. But let's summarize it. Okay, so we entered URL, then we identified server, and we've established a connection, and then we requested from resources. So we got the resources. Once we got the resources, browser undergoing critical rendering path. Okay, in this critical rendering path, first we created DOM and then CSS object model, and then we are creating render tree. Once we are done with creating render tree, we lay out the dimensions for each nodes, and then painting the changes on the UI. This is how actually it's happening. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.